However, beyond the rumors and headlines, there's a truth is far more nuanced than most people understand, particularly when they persevere the eyes of the oldest son of John Lennon. Julian Lennon has hardly ever talked to other in public. A real Renaissance man is Julian Lennon. He is a filmmaker, a recording artist, activist, environmentalist, and talented photographer whose most recent endeavors prioritize silence over conjecture. However, finally, after years of holding back, he has spoken up. Additionally, his nobody anticipated the words, because in a broken family, the most unexpected ally might occasionally come from's location that people dislike the most. The industry was horrified by these disclosures and will undoubtedly take you by surprise. The terrible tale of Julian Lennon, fourth name of one woman, has lingered on the periphery of the Lennon family narrative for decades, debated in documentaries, whispered in interviews, and frequently written off as a minor detail in the history of rock and roll. However, behind the news and conjecture conceals a reality much more nuanced than most fans understand, particularly as perceived by John Lennon's oldest son. Lennon Julian has hardly ever spoken to her in public, preferring to keep quiet rather than speculating. However, finally, after years of holding back, he has spoken up. Additionally, his nobody anticipated the words, because occasionally the most surprising in a broken family, an ally emerges from the least popular place. Long Julian Lennon came into the world prior to media curiosity, generating conjecture about his background and family history. June 8, 1963, Liverpool, England. Julian was born John Charles Lennon to Cynthia Powell and John Lennon. Being the firstborn child of one of the world's most well-known musicians, Julian's life was certain to be lived in the spotlight. However, his formative years were anything but glitzy. The strain of celebrity would be too much for the parents' marriage to bear. By 1968, thereafter, John Lennon started a new chapter with Yoko Ono. Their relationship ended, and they got divorced. Influenced Julian's childhood development. After the split, Julian spent mostly under his mother's care from the late 1960s to the 1970s. Cynthia, with whom he had little communication. John Lennon was hailed as a musical legend around the world. Julian, a peace activist, encountered a more subdued and complex form of that legacy, one characterized by desire and emotional detachment instead of continuous presence. Even though, despite being geographically distant from his father, Julian had an indisputable impact on John's artistic life. In 1974, when Paul McCartney created the now iconic song Hey Jude as a consoling message amid the emotional turmoil of the divorce, for Julian, who was young, initially, Hey Jules was an individual's attempt to soothe Theon. Of the most well-known songs in music history is about a child caught up in adult turmoil. English singer and composer, well known for albums such as Jude and Ballads. Despite Julian's youth at the time, his personal hardships helped create a cultural moment that millions of people shared, demonstrating how his life had deeply impacted the lives of people who were out of his reach. As Julian changed, he emerged from his father's shadow as an adult, not by rejecting his heritage but by creating a unique musical identity. Julian Lennon was raised in the limelight of his fame as a musician. Naturally, he is the older son of John Lennon of the Beatles, and he began performing music in 1984. Career with the publication of Valet, his debut album. The CD immediately became well known throughout the world thanks to its title tune securing the chart and notable songs Too Late for Farewell's worldwide success. Instead of being written off as only John Lennon's kid, Julian proved that his voice had its own weight. It was inevitable that his writing and voice would be compared to his father. However, his approach had a gentler, more reflective tone. The music business noticed. In 1985, just 1 year following, Julian received a Grammy Award nomination for Best New Artist for his debut, indicating that he had effectively stepped over the boundary between legitimacy and legacy. This is what he did. Achievement in 1986, when his second album, The Secret Value of Daydreaming, was released. Instead of depending only on name recognition, he continued to focus on movement rather than nostalgia, devoted to establishing reputation via reliable results. His artistic development persisted into the following 10 years. Julian's 1991 album Help Yourself featured the popular tracks. The song's emotionally stirring lyrics made it yet another turning point in his discography that expressed themes of introspection and desire. Although Salt Water is lyrical and calming, exuded wisdom and set Julian apart from the demands frequently made of heirs of legends of music. He was no longer viewed as a person who was solely influenced by his past at this time. He was drafting his, but instead of staying limited to just one artistic avenue, Julian decided to leave music in the latter part of the 1990s. He took a step back from about 1998 to the beginning of the 2000s, leaving the sector completely, opting not to follow business pressure or stale ways visible to the public. Rather, he expanded his artistic horizons by pursuing photography and philanthropy, vistas without giving up on communication. This silent rerouting wasn't an escape but an extension. Julian's choice to take a rest showed an understanding that maintaining constant visibility is not necessary to manage legacy. 2006 saw him bring together his creative passions and moral principles, via cinema by creating The Whale Dreamers is a documentary. Tonight is the premiere of an amazing documentary film in Australia, and the world is talking about it. Produced by Julian Lennon as part of an environmental project. This endeavor demonstrated that Julian did not consider creativity to be distinct from accountability. In 2009, he carried on this discussion when he released his collection of photographs, Timeless Through the Lens, instead compared to the microphone. It chose a media that permitted subtlety rather than force in order to express his perspective with the public. More than a show, in 2010, his charitable endeavors took on a more formal form when he established the White Feather Foundation as a humanitarian and environmental organization. The name itself had overtones of spiritual meaning, reflecting both ancestry and purpose, frequently associated with his father, but refocusing that symbolism on useful action. Instead of just having a well-known last name, Julian decided to use it for relief. Awareness and support for underserved communities and ecosystems. Despite Julian's charitable endeavors expanded and his comeback CD marked his musical comeback in 2011, everything changes. Instead than trying to replicate early success, this endeavor yielded a quantifiable return. Grounded, mature, and considerate, it proved that imaginative Julian's statement was independent of trends and popularity. It was merely a component of woe. He continued his literary expansion between 2015 and 2021. He spent time addressing younger generations with his children's book series, Touch the Earth, the book to your... Let's discuss it. You've authored a number of children's books, and I really enjoy this unanticipated path was not a change from his previous missions. It strengthened them. The concepts of global empathy and environmental consciousness, the kinship with nature that emerged in his charitable and documentary activity, were now being transmitted raw storytelling to children. Instead than using performance or action to preach, Julian decided to throw creativity and instruction. Possibly one of Julian's most significant life events occurred in 2022 when he published the single Imagine, which was a formal cover of his father's well-known hymn. For the first time, instead of utilizing it for sentimental purposes or self-praise, he published it in aid of Ukraine relief efforts. There were layers of meaning at that moment. The boy, who had spent a significant portion of his life balancing proximity and separation from his father's legacy, ultimately accepting one of its big essential components, to reaffirm its meaning in a new age, not to copy. It was an effort to walk with John Lennon, appreciating history but avoiding attempting to put oneself in their position, successfully establishing his own identity. The death of Julian Lennon, his grievances and, however, despite leading a life characterized by success and development, it is impossible to separate the emotional burden of the past from Lennon's story, a history that didn't just fade away with time or Among the most persistent and agonizing themes of his journey has been his tense relationship with John Lennon, his father. Despite being universally acknowledged as a cultural idol and supporter of peace, John's contribution to Julian's life was anything but perfect. Julian has discussed the emotional gap between them candidly in a number of interviews, detailing their relationship as strained and complex. It is inevitable that Julian Lennon will be compared to his renowned John's father. However, he's demonstrated that he has a sound. Fans frequently saw John through and viewed him through the prism of action and music, and has admitted that even though he loved his father's art, he was unable to deny the reality he frequently experienced, ignored, and abandoned. Although the specifics were never made public, it is known that a private contract was finally accomplished in the 1990s. Even so, the encounter demonstrated how intricate and navigating legacy was emotionally challenging, not only as a public person but as a son attempting to make love and disappointment work together. His difficulties went beyond court cases and into the realm of public opinion. Julian's affections for his father's second wife, Yoko Ono, were a persistent subject in press reports and interviews. He wasn't afraid to voice his annoyance at her dominance over John Lennon's legacy and estate, admitting that choices about his father's reputation and output were frequently without his participation. However, Julian claims that he and Yoko now keep a cordial relationship despite their previous disagreements. Connection. He doesn't take a resentful or emotional stance. It is quantified, demonstrating comprehension. That acceptance, rather than total agreement, is sometimes the first step toward peace. By speaking for himself, he has demonstrated that even while history cannot be changed, respect can endure in complex. In addition to familial dynamics, another contentious issue and the frequent comparisons to his father in the public eye have been a personal challenge. From the start of his career, Julian's work was evaluated based on how well it didn't fit the legacy of John Lennon. His songwriting, his voice, even in interviews and headlines. His physical attributes were used as benchmarks. Julian frequently perceived the similarities as a burden, whereas others saw them as a compliment. According to him, the pressure his attempts to build his own reputation were eclipsed by his need to live up to someone else's. Instead of being praised, he was frequently shown as a reflection because of his uniqueness. Music evaluations weren't the only place that weight existed. It accompanied him in all of his public activities. It was more difficult to produce freely because of the ongoing monitoring. Knowing that instead than being evaluated on the basis of individual expression, artistic choice would be evaluated in the context of legacy. His personal life was not exempted from this attention either, even though he made a conscious effort to keep his love relationships and personal affairs that were hidden from the public. The tabloids continued to make simple assumptions about his life, due to his last name. In contrast to those popular personalities who benefited greatly from attention, Julian made a deliberate choice to keep a safe distance and protect his privacy in order to keep the peace. However, even without his involvement, the dissemination of stories, the presentation of presumptions as facts, and curiosity as a right, although many celebrities react in a combative manner, Julian opted for a more subdued kind of resistance. He didn't contribute to the conjecture or let it define him. He has always had a subtle approach to controversy. He does, although he acknowledges the suffering of his past, he will not allow it to control his future. The difficult legacy of May Pang. Although Julian Lennon's path was influenced by emotional detachment, court cases, and one person from his history provided something unique during those turbulent times of frequent public comparison. Years. Constancy without anticipation. That person was a woman named May Pang, who's long been disputed, misinterpreted, or misconstrued with relation to John Lennon, depending on who was narrating the tale. But going beyond conjecture and speculation, her past shows a timeline of not looking for scandals but often anticipated allegiance. Before she was associated with any issue, May Pang was born to Chinese immigrant parents in New York City on October 24, 1950. There were no indications from her multicultural, working-class childhood that she would eventually find herself intertwined with one of rock's most intriguing and unusual periods. She didn't come into the music industry as a social climber or celebrity, but with diligent labor. She started her career with the BKCO Records in the early 1970s, serving as a receptionist for boss Alan Clean, before progressively rising to assistance for production. Despite the lack of glamour in her work, she was able to interact with artists and executives at the greatest level. Her commitment eventually earned her a position working closely with John Lennon. In between 1970, Yoko Ono worked on projects with the Beatles on Apple Records. As well as 1971. Started off as administrative assistants, quickly developed into more involvement since she gained their confidence by being dependable rather than ambitious. By 1971, her name was John and Yoko's personal assistant, managing daily duties and assisting with planning their progressively intricate routines. It was a role that needed caution and expertise as their lives combined public performance with personal expression. However, in 1973, nobody, not even May herself, could have foreseen the conclusion that was made. At the behest of Yoko Ono, May Pang went inside during his time apart from Yoko. He had a love involvement with John Lennon. This would thereafter be referred to as Lennon's Lost Weekend. But in reality, it lasted almost 18 months instead of a weekend. Analysis, criticism and sensationalization of the arrangement have been done for decades, with many people wondering if it was the result of manipulation, either emotional need or trust. However, based on May's own story and what those the relationship was not erratic or risky, as anyone around them could see. A fascinating examination of a complex connection between the two. Okay, Sandy, I am grateful that it was unexpectedly domestic in 1973. Up until 1975. May initially resided in Los Angeles and then New York with Lennon, both as an observer but as a collaborator in his artistic and personal life. She assisted in overseeing his recording sessions, which included the Rock and Bridges, Walls and Roll, not just as a friend but also as someone who was aware of his rhythms, emotions and creative tendencies. Possibly the most significant aspect of her relationship with John Lennon. She urged him to get back in touch with his estranged son. In 1974, Lennon arrived. Julian, while many members of DJ's inner circle continued to be preoccupied with his public image or musical endeavors, May acknowledged the significance of healing personal injuries. She helped set up early contact between the father and son, assisting in the restoration of a long-broken bond. For Julian, who had devoted a large portion of these trips turned into crucial steps in comprehending the man behind the mythology, fulfilling a child's desire for recognition. Here, May's contribution went beyond tabloid stories. She wasn't just a short-term romantic partner, at a time when few others cared about such issues. She was a healing facilitator. Matters. The chapter did not, however, last forever. In the year 1975, John Lennon ended his romantic involvement with May Pang and made amends with Yoko Ono. In contrast to many public separations, there was no dramatic fallout or scandalous implosion. Instead, May took a silent step aside, honoring Jay's choice while bearing the burden of her life's experiences into the following stage. Late in the 1970s, and she continued to be involved in the music business throughout the 1980s, focusing on artist management, photography, as well as licensing. Instead of making quick money off of her affiliation with Lennon, she decided to develop her career on her own, acquiring abilities that weren't based on her background but rather on her ongoing professionalism. She wed record executive Tony in 1983. Viz. Canti, a well-respected musician who collaborated with musicians including David. Although the marriage ended in divorce, It was the beginning of a new phase of stability in her otherwise unusual way of living. May also published photo sets during this time that included Lennon during their years together, a decision that some regarded as exploiting her history, while others saw it as her right token v her viewpoint following years of rumors that were said over her. These pictures provided a more gentle perspective of Lennon during his lost weekend. He displayed quiet domesticity, dogs, joy, and times without. They sparked controversy rather than adding to it. By the year 2002, May Pang released her story, Loving John, over 30 years after her romance with Lennon ended.